Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tapan Parikh. Dr. Parikh is an assistant professor in the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include human-computer interaction, mobile computing, information systems to support microfinance, smallholder agriculture, and global health. For more than 10 years, Dr. Parikh has been designing, developing, and deploying information systems in the rural developing world, initially in India, but now also in Latin America and Africa. He and his students have started several technology companies that serve rural communities and the development sector. Dr. Parikh holds a Bachelor's of Science in Molecular Modeling with honors from Brown University, a Master's of Science and a Ph.D. in Computer Science from the University of Washington, where he won the William Chan Award for a Ph.D. dissertation. Dr. Parikh has received several grants to support his work, including awards from the National Science Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Technology Review magazine named Dr. Parikh as Humanitarian of the Year in 2007, and Esquire magazine called him the best and the brightest in 2008. The title of Dr. Parikh's talk is Designing a More Equitable Internet. Let's welcome him.
I'm just going to plug this in so we don't have the computer going off every few seconds. It's a great pleasure to be here and an honor to be introduced by John and by Dan. And I've just heard a bit about the work you guys are respectively starting in this area. And it's really exciting, to hear that you're starting an ICTD group and having more faculty and students in this area. I think there's clearly a lot of potential for using this new medium and platform for empowerment and supporting beneficial social processes around the world. And so I'm really glad to see researchers and practitioners and policymakers get involved in this area, and I think it's a great thing to be involved with, and I'm excited to see more and more people doing it. That said, I'm a computer scientist by training. I'll give you a little bit of given that this is probably a pretty diverse group from a disciplinary perspective, I'll give a little background on where I'm coming from as an academic. So I'm a computer scientist by training. My focus is largely on how you build the things. And by things I mean information technologies, internet services, etc. And the challenge here that I perceive is that, beyond the challenges of just physical access, there's just some fundamental challenges in making computing applications and the internet more broadly accessible to people who come from a really wide background in terms of their prior experience with computers, their basic literacy, their education, their language, their culture. And so a lot of my talk is going to be about how do we adapt computing technologies or design innovative new technologies that can speak to some of these needs, that can address some of the diversity that we see in the world, right? And so the first thing I want to show is that there really is a challenge here, right? So while we see that mobile phones in all their glory for being person-to-person communications devices are really very quickly being adopted by communities around the world and including in developing countries, the internet just hasn't taken off in the same way. If we look at worldwide adoption of the internet in countries like India and sub-Saharan Africa, we're just seeing a very marginal adoption of the internet. And so there are clearly a set of challenges inherent in making the internet and computing more accessible to wide parts of the population. And this goes beyond what I argue would be simple challenges of physical access. It's not only that people don't have computing capable devices, that they don't have data plans. Beyond that, there are just a bunch of, those are important concerns still, but beyond that, there's just a basic set of cultural assumptions and required competencies that are built into the internet and how we reason about the internet. To interact with computing applications requires certain technical fluency. It requires literacy in a mainstream world language in many cases. You have a lot of difficulty representing knowledge and information in a way that's respectful and cognizant of the kinds of cultural backgrounds that people are coming from and how they are relating to one another emotionally. And so how do we use the internet or adapt the internet to be more user-friendly in this way? And that's really the core challenge that I'm working on. How do we take the internet and create new interfaces to the internet that can reach wider sections of the population? So, I'll start this talk by talking about some work that I did back when I was a Ph.D. student at the University of Washington. And so here I was looking at microfinance groups, very small basic savings and loan cooperatives. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of microfinance through the work of Grameen Bank and Muhammad Yunus. And so I won't go into detail about the basic model, but the basic concept is simple. You have small groups that get together, they save money, they make loans, and they use that to support various kinds of needs and livelihood activities in the village. So this clearly, even though there are very simple financial products being offered, requires something more than some non-trivial record keeping and reporting that needs to happen to make sure that these loans are monitored, they're tracked, that they're repaid on time. And this creates a lot of challenges within groups for being able to make sure that they remain transparent and they remain accountable, and to make sure that fundamentally that the loans come back on time. And so what this often requires is, they will have, in this picture, all of these women here are members of this group, but this guy is just a local person they've hired to basically keep their records. They pay him a small amount, and he keeps the records for them, and he tells them who needs to pay what, who is paid already, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this solution is suboptimal for a number of ways. First of all, you have to rely on this external person. He may or may not be trustworthy. You have to pay them. That creates additional burden. How do these records get aggregated over time? Lots of challenges are inherent in this model, not the least of which is that it fundamentally constrains the complexity of the financial products that can be offered to people. So how can we mitigate this? So being a computer scientist, clearly the solution involves computers in some way, and computers are nothing else if not glorified adding machines. And so how can we use an adding machine in this context? How can we use a computer and the facilities it provides to improve the transparency and the ability of these kinds of groups to offer financial services? So using this as a starting point, and as a very early starting point, we thought, how will we design a computing application that is usable by this group, given their background, given their education, given their literacy, given their composition, and would allow them to do the kinds of basic record keeping and analysis that the group requires. So simply as a thought experiment at this point, we're not proposing that every village gets a computer. We started thinking about how we might effectively deploy computing applications within this group. And so the first thing we did was we start making some simple prototypes. And I come from a background in computer science called human-computer interactions, the subdiscipline I'm from. And here we really value, from a design perspective, iteration. And so the first thing we do is we start with really simple prototypes of how such an application might look, and we ask people to use it and give us feedback on what's working, what they relate to, and what they don't relate to, and we use that feedback to improve the next iteration, and that's how we eventually get to a workable solution. So we took the first iteration, we deployed, had a team of programmers, designers work on it after doing some initial needs assessment and background work in terms of discussing the requirements in terms of reporting and data keeping. And we had a prototype, and we brought it to a village. We put it on a laptop, not too different from my MacBook Air there. And we bring it to a village. We were being facilitated by an NGO. And so right after the meeting ends, they introduce us, and they say, hey, here's this research team. At that time, I was working for the MIT Media Lab. And so they were like, here's this research group from MIT. They've come to develop the system to help you keep your records. And so I come, and I put down the laptop in the middle of the village square, and I say, here you go. Here's the application. Don't thank me now. Thank me later. And so everyone's overjoyed. All the women are like, this is amazing. You are fantastic. Your mother must be so proud. And so you've saved a lot. You've saved so much effort. But they haven't even seen the application. The laptop's over there. They're all still in their own seats. And we're like, okay, that's great. We appreciate your response, but we need someone to actually come and use it to give us the feedback that we need to improve the application. So some women will gingerly come up, they'll look into it, look at it. It's great. Fantastic. I've seen it. It's beautiful. but they're still like 4 feet away. They haven't even touched the computer yet. And then this reaction is not, we were like, come on, you got to use it. We need feedback. We got to write a paper. The deadline's coming. And so, from our perspective, this was natural. But from their perspective, it was very natural. Their response also, from their perspective, they're thinking, this man has brought a strange silver box. He's claiming this is going to solve our problems. But what information I do know is that A, that box is expensive, and B, this guy, he ain't sticking around, And so the best that can happen here is that I'm going to use this, I'm going to damage it in some way, I'm going to pay for this computer, lots of loans will need to be taken out, this, better I just stay away, the benefits are limited, the costs are very high, let me just keep my distance here, right? And so this reaction is entirely natural if you look at what they were looking at on the screen, right? So this would be the equivalent application for you. Right? It's in Chinese. Maybe you understand it, but for the rest of us, it's in Chinese. And so there are very few reference points for someone like us who doesn't understand Chinese, and even beyond this, if you compound this with literacy, for them to have a frame of reference with which to interact with this. How do they have a sense of what this is for? How would they use it? It seems completely foreign, this strange silver box with these weird letters and pictures of people that they don't know. That has nothing to do with me. This guy seems genuinely nice and well-intentioned. Let me make sure he feels good about it himself. But this, nothing to do with me, right? And so that's the initial reaction. This is a foreign technology, a foreign application. There is no bridge. There's no bridge between me and what this does, right? And so while we didn't build something in Chinese, we did as much as we could to create reference points that the people could relate to, right? So pictures, text in the local language, symbolic representations, but none of this was enough. All of this was still perceived as foreign. It didn't speak their language, right? So how to get around this? So we thought about this, we went back to the lab, and we're like, this is a big problem, right? How do we get people to even feel confident engaging with something like this, to try things, to experiment, to use it? How do we build this familiarity? How do we reduce intimidation? So we did something where we basically picked an area of the screen, here it's on the right, where we said, this is a safe zone. You can do what you want here. These are just symbols. Nothing's going to happen. No dramatic changes in the application. You're not going to change the data. You're not going to damage the machine. Just play around in that area. It's a safe area. So we created this kind of egress for people to feel comfortable experimenting. And as we all know, we learn through experimenting, right? And so eventually, the women, one of the leaders of the group would say, okay, he's saying it's safe. That means at the very least, if I break the computer, he's going to pay for it. And so let me give it a shot now, And so they're playing around in this area. They're using the mouse. We explain how the mouse works. They figure out some of these things are buttons, and you can click on it. And so eventually, someone clicks on one of the buttons. So at that point, what happens is that it repeated the name of that button, the value of that button, what it means in the local language, which in this case was Tamil. And so as soon as they heard the computer speak in Tamil, there was a dramatic qualitative shift in everyone's kind of relation to the technology. Everyone moved closer. Everyone kind of listened in. Everyone started looking, because this was no longer a strange silver box. This was a Tamil-speaking strange silver box, right? And that made all the difference, right? Now this box could speak their language. There was a bridge. And what this experience really reinforced for me was the importance of one's spoken language in one's own native tongue, and the value of that in creating these kinds of cultural bridges. In the world that we live in, which is largely dominated by textual interactions more and more so, we forget how important it is to hear someone speak in our language. If we go to a foreign country, if we immigrate to a new country, that feeling of finding someone that speaks your language is indescribable. It's that bridge, it's that connection, it's that feeling of home, it's that feeling that this is something that I have a relation to, right? And it was amazing to see that same effect with technology, the importance that we often forget to attribute to the power of spoken language in your own tongue, right? So this is a kind of a long-winded motivation to talk about how we're exploring the use of spoken language in your own tongue as a mechanism to increase access to the internet and to internet-like services. So now I'm going to talk about a project called Awaz Day. Awaz Day, for those of you who don't speak Hindi, it means give voice, Awaz Day. And this is a project that's looking into an entirely new user group, small-scale subsistence farmers. Right? Small farmers have tons of issues that they need information for, but how can we present it to them in a way that's accessible, credible, convincing, and useful, actionable, right? And this project is trying to address this basic challenge. So the first, our partner, one thing I should say before we get started, I know you've heard Kentaro speak, some of you, so we always have local partners. I want to make sure that's really clear, right? So all of the work that I'm going to be talking about is done with local organizations on the ground. And what we think of ourselves as is tool builders to essentially amplify the change-making potential of organizations that are already working on the ground. And in this case, we were working with an organization called Development Support Center. This is an NGO based in Ahmedabad in Gujarat in India, who works very actively in informing farmers about issues of relevance to them. So one of their main activities is that they produce a weekly agricultural radio show, which goes out over the local FM station. It's 15 minutes a week, and has basically radio personalities talking about issues of interest to the local agricultural community, what to plant, recent pests, weather forecasts, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very popular show, and it's so popular that people want to talk to the personalities. People want to be able to have them answer their questions. They want to be able to interact with them, right? And so this is, for some of you who use Twitter or use social media, Internet's a very amazing way to communicate with people you would have otherwise had no access to, right? So for this radio show, what they used to do is that for an hour after the radio program, the radio personalities would literally leave their personal cell phones on, and they would take calls from the audience. They would have people call them up, ask them questions, respond to them. And this was so popular that their phone would ring nonstop for an hour, basically. And most of the people that called in would get a busy signal. And so we started thinking, how can we mitigate this, right? So this was the basic challenge we faced. This is the radio program, some pictures about the production. So the basic intuition that comes from this is that farmers have tons of questions for which they want credible and useful and locally relevant answers for, right? This fact that the phone was running off the hook while it was available to the farmers just shows that they have tons and tons of questions. The second challenge is that the answer is not on Google. So surprise, right? If you have a question, I need to plant my crops, right? And you look at the answers. First search result, no good. Second search result, third result, that's my answer, right? That's how our information seeking is more and more akin to, right? Google is the answer to all of our questions. Well, unfortunately, that's not true for a small farmer in rural India. First of all, they don't have access to Google, right? They don't have an internet-capable phone, or they don't have a computer that they go into. Second, Google is not available in their language. Third, and probably most importantly, the answer to their question is not even on the internet yet. It's maybe buried in some research paper, but probably not even that. Even if it exists on the internet, it's not in a language they understand. It's not from a source they respect and trust. So fundamentally, the answer to their question is not on the internet. Shocking, right? I was surprised. So what to do? The answer, if the answer is not Google, well, what are you going to do, right? And so we built basically a phone-based system that serves as Google for these farmers and connects them to credible, locally relevant sources of knowledge. So how does this work? So the first thing they do is they make a phone call using an everyday ordinary phone to a service that we set up, a toll-free number, and they're able to navigate a menu to either ask a question, have their question recorded, or to browse prior questions and answers, just like what we would do when we would search the internet, right? Or to hear general announcements or advice or news, et cetera, et cetera. Once a question was recorded, it goes onto an internet-hosted site. On that site, we have a moderator. A moderator works for DSC in this case. He fulfills basically the role of information router. So this is something we have that Google doesn't have. Google doesn't need a person in the middle to interpret the query because the query comes in as natural text. Here, the query is coming in as voice in a local language. Google doesn't know anything to do with it, right? So you need a person in the middle who's able to handle and triage and manage these kinds of questions that are coming in. How does he do that? So a question comes in, It comes into an interface very much like you would see in your inbox with your email client. And so what he does, basically an hour a day, he triages email, except the emails are voice questions from farmers. And for each question, he basically adds some metadata about the caller. All the callers introduce themselves, they say where they're from. He puts some metadata about the question, including what crop it deals with, what other topic it deals with, some other keywords related to the question. What is this useful for? If a farmer calls the next day and he wants an answer about cotton or corn or soybeans, he can be directed to all the prior questions specific to his interests and not all of the questions that aggregated in this database. So just in the same way that Google's algorithms add metadata to our queries and our content to be able to make them searchable, indexed, ranked, filtered, etc., here we have humans in the middle that are doing that same basic task of adding value to content to make it more easy to retrieve later. Based on these categorization, the system also manages a database of responders, people who have expertise in different areas, on specific crops, on specific topics. This might be a person who works for the NGO. It might be a scientist at a local university. It might even be a progressive or a lead farmer that's in the network that might have even been identified through the system because of the kinds of questions they were asking, right? And so we build and we grow this database of experts who have a knowledge that's relevant to different kinds of queries and informational requests. Based on who the question is assigned to, that person gets a call at his house at a time of his choosing that says, hey, Vivek, we know you're an expert farmer about cotton. We've had 5 cotton queries in the last day. Can you answer them, right? So for each of those queries, he can say either, I have an answer right now, let me provide it to you, and he records his answer. He's able to re-record if he's not happy with it. If he doesn't have an answer right away, he can say, hey, call me back in 2 days. I need to research this, right? So he can say, call me back in 2 days. I'm going to have an answer for you then. And so that gives him some time to think about the problem, prepare a good response. He can also say, I don't know the answer, but this guy in the next village, he knows all about that issue. He tried it out last week. He's got some information for you. And so he can also forward the question to another farmer, right? What does this do? Well, this increases the sources of our potential knowledge. We grow our database of responders virally by people recommending other people. And we have more and more resources that we can go to if we have questions like that in the future. So once he's responded, or the second guy has responded, the response goes immediately out to the farmer. We notify him either via a phone call or via an SMS message, your question has been answered. Please call back to retrieve it. And so he can go ahead and do that. And now he has an answer to his question. The next time a farmer calls, if he's got a similar problem, he can browse through and maybe he'll come across the answer that's been provided already. Or maybe the moderator can say, hey, instead of routing this to an expert, this question was answered last week. So instead of answering it again, I'll just route the answer from last week to this question, right? So the moderator, again, fulfills this essential role of matching information requests to content using a combination of both technology and human intervention, right? Which makes this a bit different than how Google does things. Now, finally, if there's something that everyone should know, right? Someone has reported a new kind of pest, a new kind of bug, or a disease that's going across all the cotton crops in the region, and the response is something all the cotton farmers should know, well, then they can broadcast it to all the cotton farmers that they know of. They can say, hey, tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, let all the cotton farmers know that there's this new bug, you should be aware of it, and here are the responses to that bug. How do we know who are cotton farmers? Easy. They've called before with a question about cotton, right? And so through this process, we're curating a database of farmers, a database of experts, and a database of content, right? Which makes the system better as you use it, right? That's hopefully one of the ideals of the internet, something that gets better with use. The more information you put into it, the more you interact with it, all of that is used to make the system better, to improve the quality of the content, to improve the responsiveness of the system. Yeah?
How local is the moderator? How close to all the people are they?
That's a good question. So in this case, it's a statewide deployment, right? And so there's one central office that's managing it for the whole state. And so so that moderator typically knows about has a basic working knowledge about all the major cash crops in the region, all of the basic regions in the state, right? And so that's the information that they use. And so in other cases, the same system has been deployed with smaller groups of people, in which case the moderator is much more close to the action, as it were. And so, it's in some sense the same trade-off as if in your very small mailing list or discussion forum with your research group, right? That limits who's going to answer your question, but also gives you a lot of context with which to interpret answers and your sense of community, as opposed to a very big mailing list with lots of people on it, which gives you a wider source of potential answers, but also less context maybe to interpret them, right? Any other questions? So I'm happy to take questions, by the way. Yeah?
So how do you monitor the quality of the answers?
That's a great question, and that's an area of active research that we're working on, right? And so we are working on, one, getting user feedback. So as soon as you get an answer, you get to rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 or 0 to 1 or something to give you some feedback of what that information was useful to you or not. We're actually comparing different kinds of rating schemes and mechanisms and see how much informational content they generate. We're also working on kind of selectively getting quality feedback from experts, right? So if you get a set of answers that were generated by other farmers, right? So one part of the system I didn't mention is that even a farmer can answer another farmer's question. They can browse through the questions. They can say, hey, I have an answer to that, provide a response. How good is that response? Well, that could be vetted by the moderator, by other experts, et cetera. Yeah. Yeah.
And how do you deal with illiterate farmers? When they receive the information, how do they respond? How do they, make sense of it?
Well, it's all in voice. So the literacy issue doesn't come up, right? And so they hear the language and hear the answer in their own language in recorded voice. So literacy isn't the constraint there. One question is how difficult is just the voice navigation of being able to go through the menus, et cetera, right? And so our experience is so far that just about anyone has the basic skills required. Basic numeric, what it requires is numeric literacy to be able to follow the prompts, right? And then some understanding of how to make a phone call and receive them. And so those are very easy to learn, and so it's not, at least in our experience, maybe some, there might be some different explanations, but the real barrier to people using this kind of service is having access to a phone, feeling empowered to use the phone, having enough access to a phone to be able to receive the return message. Those are the kinds of challenges we've seen. The literacy issues haven't come up as much as we've seen, although they may be present with particular populations. Yeah.
So when someone's browsing data, like questions that have already been answered, how do you do that? Like it seems, when you have Google, you can type in any subject.
That's a great question too. So right now it's pretty coarse-grained. It's limited to the metadata that the moderator adds, right? So the moderator is able to add information about what crop it is, what keyword. So there's some information added there, but and that's basically used to drive a menu-based interaction. So press 1 to get all the questions about cotton. Press 2 to get all the questions about rice, right? So that gives you a very coarse kind of categorization. The other techniques we're working on, and this is why this is active CS research, right? There's some hard CS problems here. So the second thing we're working on is using essentially what's called social filtering. So can you rank and filter content? We can build a model of similarity between farmers based on the questions they ask, based on the kind of content that we listen to. And once we have this similarity model, we can use one person's browsing behavior to help inform how another person, recommendations and stuff like that, right? And so that's an active area for research for us. And the third part of this is I think we can use systems like this to actually fundamentally improve speech recognition tools for under-resourced languages, right? And so we're generating large amounts of local language voice content in languages that have very few training resources available, right? And so we can use this system to bootstrap basic speech recognition systems that are not only tailored to language, but they're tailored to specific topics, right? Because we're building this corpus that's specific to agriculture in Gujarat, for example. And so with appropriate labeling of this data, we might be able to build better speech recognition, word finding tools and stuff. Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about the cost of this and who bears those costs and how it compares to the traditional way of calling into the radio station that you started with?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And so the cost of this is borne by the NGO, the service, the person that's offering the service, right? So in this case, it's DSC. And so we essentially, now this, I'll show you in a couple of slides, this has become a startup company which is essentially offering this as a hosted service to not-for-profit organizations, right? And our pricing model is that they pay for two things, right? One is basically hosting this content and the site, right, which we try to make as cheap as possible by getting economies of scale, and then the airtime, how much airtime is incurred. And so the airtime, you know, what we've moved to, originally the system was toll-free, and all the experiments I'll talk about next were all done with a toll-free site. But now it's a toll site, you know, where farmers pay their own airtime. So basically they have to get value out of the response to use that airtime. And then selective subsidization, you know, so selectively we'll broadcast messages out, we'll broadcast answers out, we'll give, you know, kind of promotional messages that allow people some free browsing, right? And so, so the cost of this is essentially some small fixed fee plus is what the variable cost of the airtime plus the person's time to do the moderation, right? So strictly speaking, you know, it's definitely probably more expensive than just having someone turn on their cell phone for an hour, right? And it's definitely going to cost you someone's time in the middle. But you know, ideally, you're using the expert's time more effectively, right? They're not sitting there responding to redundant queries, et cetera. So you're doing better resource use there, and the rest of it's used to provide a better service. But that's a great question. You know, any other questions? Cool. Keep going. So you can see here, you know, how basically through this process you can have a discussion thread, just like a discussion thread on an email forum. You have a question, you have an answer, you might have a farmer that follows up with their own clarification, et cetera, right? So this system was tested back in 2009. You know, we did a pilot test to essentially understand whether or not the system would be adopted, whether it would be used, whether it would lead to the same kinds of peer-to-peer knowledge sharing phenomena that we see on the internet, basically to assess whether or not we can recreate internet-like phenomena using this kind of medium, right? And so we had a variety of users that had diverse literacy and ages. So one thing that you can see here is that the system saw sustained usage over a 6-month period. You know, there was some initial novelty effect, but it was used consistently over the 6 months that it was deployed. This is calls per week, and so with 60 users, we were getting approximately 200 calls per week pretty regularly, and so people were calling several times a week on average. The other thing you'll see is that we had here the feature of being able to listen to announcements, being able to listen to archived radio programs, and being able to ask questions and to listen to other people's questions, right? And by far the dominant usage was for question and answer. So that shows that not only is there a demand for kind of static, archived, high-quality content, but this kind of more dynamic peer-to-peer content was also very highly valued by users of the system, and in some sense more than the static content. So this is, again, consistent with some of our experience with the internet. You saw that farmers were also very active in answering questions. Out of the 300 answers, roughly, that were generated in the system, a sizable fraction were asked by other or answered by other farmers. Lurking, you know, so those of you who know what lurking means, just means kind of listening in to conversations, right? 73% of the traffic to the system was just farmers calling in and listen to other farmers' questions and answers. We had examples where a farmer would go out into his field at night, you know, where they had to be, when the water came, they had to be responsible for turning it on and making sure the fields got irrigated. And so they'd be out there overnight in the farm. And so while they were there overnight, they would just, remember this is toll-free now, so they would just call into the system, put in their headphones, and just listen, like a podcast. You know, they'd be listening in to everyone's questions and answers, right? And so they were really, you know, there was just a lack of this kind of content available to them. And so this just showed that there was a large demand for it. One experiment that we did later on was that, you know, in this initial experiment, everyone told us that they wanted information from experts, scientists. That's what we want, PhDs, right? And so later on, we did an experiment where we had the same kind of information, the same knowledge, advice that was recorded both by farmers and recorded by scientists. And each of them introduced themselves. I'm a scientist, I'm a farmer. And our hypothesis going in was clearly people will follow up more with the scientist advice. And contrary to our expectations, people actually followed up significantly more with peer advice, right? And so there could be several, I'm not saying that means peers are more influential, but it does show that there's a significant unmet demand for information from peers, right? That is not being met by traditional media and information channels, right? That's forthcoming work. So yeah, it's just an unmet need for highly local, relevant, information and content from your peers, and that's what we were able to show here. Another interesting phenomena is the distribution of users and usage. And so these are the individual callers. This is the number of calls they made. This is plotted on a log scale on the left. And so you can just see that there's a typical power law distribution like you see and has been demonstrated for a lot of internet social media sites as well, where you have a couple of people at the top that are really using the system a lot, and that falls off over the rest of the users. These most frequent callers, while we don't have enough data here to be able to say things conclusively, but there was some common characteristics amongst the top 3 callers. They all were pretty progressive experimental farmers. That means that they were experimenting with things like organic farming, that they were trying out new kinds of contraptions in their farms, basically just thinking out of the box, ambitious, dynamic people. They were all pretty young, less than 30. They were remote geographically, so they didn't have sources of local market towns where they had this kind of exposure regularly. They had less education. So you can see that there are people in these remote places that have all of the ambition, enthusiasm that we see amongst all of ourselves. They're just limited by barriers of physical location, literacy, education, so they're not able to participate in these knowledge processes. When they're given the opportunity, they do it, and they do it in spades. And so there's clearly a lot of demand for interacting in this way. Just a bit of feedback. This was a farmer called back to our site, left us some feedback. It says, "Congratulations, I will be forever in your debt. The service you are offering, I pray to God that you keep offering it." So here's the amazing part, right? Farmers will learn so much if an ordinary person is able to ask a question, you remember it, and you send me a message while I'm sitting in my house, right? Again, this is what the internet allows us to do, and I guess we've become jaded. You're sitting in your house, you ask a question, you get an answer right back where you're sitting. That's incredible for a farmer. He has to go to the market town, he has to call some people he doesn't know. That just facility isn't available to him. And so just providing that simple ability to answer your questions using this mechanism that's accessible was just so appreciated. In the 7 years I've been farming, this is the first time I got good information. Congratulations. And just to sweeten things up, he asks another question, right? And so, and so you can see, this is not just empty praise. He's getting somewhere, and where he's getting is more questions, right? Clearly he's not done with our system, right? And so, we really get excited when we see stuff like this because it shows it's being used. This is one challenge, as I'm sure you've heard in prior talks here, is kind of technology transfer here. My colleagues, they just wait for Google to do whatever they're doing, and that's technology transfer. Well, there's no Google, at least so far, trying to serve the needs of small farmers in rural India. And so what do we do here? And so what ends up happening is we end up doing our own startup companies most of the time. And so we've done a startup company here to make this service more available to organizations across India. And so we've got a company called Awaz. My student just graduated. He's moving to India to be the CEO of this company. And we've got a number of customers across India, served over 100,000 calls already. And we're using it for a number of different applications. It started with agricultural extension, as I described. We're also using it for monitoring labor conditions, labor rights, youth social networking, education, human rights, and in locations across India. So this has been going really well. Initially this just started because we had our computer hosted with the NGO in their premises, and they had terrible electricity. They kept turning the power off. The connectivity would go off. So eventually we had to set up an office, put the computer there. Once we did that, other organizations started coming. We want you to do this for us also. And so before we knew it, we had 4 people with 4 different organizations we were hosting out of this office. And some of them decided to start paying us, and so we're like, wait, we have to do something with this money. And so we started a company, and so we'll see how it goes, but it's been exciting so far. I talked about some of the research questions here. Clearly a lot of fundamental CS research questions around how do you do the information retrieval, how do you do speech recognition. We're also interested in using this kind of platform to understand how farmer social networks work, how information diffusion works within these communities, and basically understanding the impact of some of these. So I'm collaborating with development economists to do a randomized control trial that would assess what the impact of this kind of intervention is on agricultural productivity, yield, incomes, et cetera. And it'd be interesting to see how all of these models will change once we have more widespread access to smartphones, internet services. I imagine you'll be able to do things like add pictures and videos relatively easily if the data costs are affordable. So we're excited to do some of those things as well. So any questions on this project before I move on? Yeah?
I'm
Just wanted to find out what happened. You said they were alerting 73% when it was toll-free. What happened when it became toll?
Great question. So, yeah, skeleton in the closet now. So it's not a skeleton, it's data, right? And so we have a toll-free, we have a couple of toll-free customers, we also have some toll customers. And it's interesting to see how their usage patterns differ. And so in our toll customers that pay for their own airtime, the frequency of calling remains roughly the same. They still call just as often to ask questions, to kind of catch up on what's going on, but the length of each interaction has reduced dramatically. Here the average call time was 5 minutes. Now we're probably looking at a minute average call time. And what that really affects is not the strict transactional stuff, because that still happens, but the social, serendipitous, peer-to-peer kinds of interactions that we saw on this site, the podcast listening, all that has gone to virtually nil, right? And so, I'm not a policy researcher, but I would love to convince policy researchers that this is an important thing to study. And in fact, they have studied this already, the effect of metering on some of the behaviors that you'll see on the internet, right? And so this just goes, from my perspective, to argue that we need to subsidize connectivity in a way that leads to the same kinds of innovation that we saw on the internet, right? Because internet was available to academic researchers and people working for various organizations for free for a long, long time, which led to the kinds of innovation that we saw. That same kind of head start needs to be given to telephony and telephony services. But, yeah.
Do you have any initial sense of the impact that you said you were going to look at, let's say on agriculture? I mean, it sounds like we have some anecdotal information.
Yeah, right now we're strictly in the world of anecdotal, and so nothing rigorous. Anecdotally, we have people have told us, hey, we called your service, I got some advice, saved me $5,000, So anecdotally, we have lots of evidence of people calling us and giving us feedback to the effect that this access to this information either saved them a lot of money or exposed them to knowledge that they didn't have before. But it's all anecdotal. We don't have anything rigorous. I don't rush to do that kind of experiment, right? Because the kind of experiments that are useful for us to improve the design, which is really what's important to me, can be a lot more quick and dirty than someone who actually needs to establish a counterfactual and show the effect. And so we wait until we get the intervention right before we do that.
Right, so the follow-up is, at least as I think you described it, this design, this model depends at least in part on NGOs that are willing to pay the freight. And they're places that they don't have much capital hanging around.
Right.
So how do they respond when you say, we don't know yet?
Well,
are they convinced by the attractiveness of the concept, or they're just willing to do it? How do they decide?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first, I wish NGOs decided on the basis that you're alluding to. Unfortunately, they don't decide on the basis of the potential impact of an intervention. They decide on the basis of a potential fundability of the intervention, right? Okay. And so this is clearly a very fundable intervention. And so lots of NGOs are rushing to us because it's their opportunity to have a mobile project that they can go to their funders with, right? So that's a lot of where the demand comes from right now. Again, more skeletons in the closet, right? But that's what's happening. And so I think there's a larger systemic problem in how not-for-profit efforts are identified, recognized, and rewarded, which would lead to the kind of question you're asking being much more relevant. I think your question would be much more relevant if we were trying to, for example, convince a government to do this. A government might look at things on that basis, and we'd be and that's why we're doing the assessment, is to more convince people at a policy level than NGOs, right? That whole NGO question is a whole rat hole, so I'll stay away from it. But
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about sort of the time horizon when technologies and approaches to the application of technologies are useful. What would you say is the time horizon when the sun will set on voice internet and smartphones? Let's take India, since you were in India. Will this be something you think that will have legs for 5 years, 2 years, 10 years?
Some parts of it, yes. Some parts of it, no, right? And for different people, right? So there's a couple of answers to the question. So I think the basic understanding we're developing about people's interaction with the service, the social phenomena that we're observing, the kinds of considerations that go into those phenomena, the impacts of some of these interventions, Those are, I think, won't change with technology so much, right? You know, that the technology will just add another way to deliver those kinds of services, allow you to add richer content, including videos, pictures, et cetera, which will improve the service. But the basic learnings about the interaction, about the social phenomena that we're observing, about the efficacy and the impact, that I don't think will change. So I think some elements of this work have longevity, other elements are, have a shorter time frame. And even the technology, I think, has a relatively long time frame, right? Because I think even with the adoption of smartphones and other full-featured phones, I think the thing you have to understand is that there's always going to be a lot of heterogeneity, as there is right now. Even right now, even mobile phone adoption, if you're going to talk about an individual basis, it's probably 50% household level in India, right? So even mobile phones haven't reached everywhere. And so there's just going to be a lot of heterogeneity of people with no access, people with limited access, people with relatively rich access, people with full access, right? And what are kind of, and people's social networks will cut across these divisions, right? You'll have people who left back in a village, your grandparents, your cousins who didn't do so well, right? Lots of people will kind of cut across these, right? And so even the social network and the applications have to deal with this heterogeneity, right? Or they will exacerbate potentially existing divides, right? And so the way we think about our company and this project now is essentially internet for the few and phones for the many, right? And that's the kind of heterogeneity we're dealing with now. How do you develop applications and services that scale gracefully when a few people have internet and lots of people have phones? And so one way we're positioning this kind of product is that if you're young, internet connected, you know, dynamic, wanting to experiment new things, well, you can host one of these services. You can use this platform to host your own content and host your own social network, which is able to engage productively with lots of people who are still on phones. Yeah.
Maybe too early in your extensions beyond agriculture to answer this, but I'm wondering, agriculture advice is something that's very tangible to the individual. They're willing to invest in it because they get a payoff as an individual, whereas something like human rights is a public good that may be of more distant value to any given individual. Have you seen differences in how people are using this technology based on the topic?
Yeah, well, at this point, given the number of deployments we have, we can't tease apart the application area from our partner in that area. So, a lot of the things we're seeing is about how effective our partner is in that area, how invested they are in the technology, and there's clearly a lot of variance in that, right? I get daily reports of how many phone calls were made from every one of our partners, and so I can just tell you there's a lot of variance. And so, and a lot of that is their own incentive mechanisms, why they're doing the work, right? But the other thing you said, I think that's a real important concern. It kind of speaks to my earlier point about what the right policy actions here would be, right? And so this kind of metered model of pay per minute really pushing all of the costs onto the end user, and that I don't think is going to be sufficient for us to see the kinds of innovation and creation of public goods, like Wikipedia, we have seen on the internet, right? Internet benefited a lot, both in terms of the innovation and in terms of the creation of public knowledge goods from relatively cheap, subsidized access to it, right? And so if we want to see the same phenomena using telephony, we have to create the playing field that allows it to happen. Yeah. Any other questions? Am I done with my talk? Do I get more time?
Yeah, you get another half an hour.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm not sure if this exists as much in India, but is there any interest from agencies or groups that are set up to provide the more authoritative information that exists? Because this is a beautiful grassroots sharing of information, but there's long traditions in some other countries of having outreach kinds of services.
So
what's the link to information that goes beyond what the farmers might?
Fair, but sorry if I wasn't clear, but DSC is an authority, right? And a lot of the questions here are being answered by experts and by acknowledged experts. So DSC, the partner we're working with, has been active in agricultural extension in Gujarat for 25 to 30 years. They are. They actually are the trainers of the extension service. So the government extension service often come to DSC to be trained by them, right? And so, yes, I think it has to be driven by that. It has to be driven by a credible information source that has access to good advice, and then the peer can happen around that, right?
Are you focusing only in Gujarat, or are you going to scale that up?
No, we currently have deployment in Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Bombay, Karnataka, several states. But there are some technical challenges with doing that, but yeah.
But how does this tie in with the village knowledge centers that are being set up in the country?
Village knowledge centers. Are they being set up? I don't know.
Well, sporadically.
Sporadically.
Yeah.
So I in my travels through India, Deep, did you do anything about these village knowledge centers? Did anyone talk about them when you did field work with us?
No, because,
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, it's mentioned in the National Knowledge Commission.
Yeah, they want to do this for sure, right? But whether or not the funding and the political will exists to do it is a different question entirely, right? So I think getting the general issue of providing wider internet access and giving people access to computers and those kinds of skills, that's not happening through those kinds of mechanisms, but there are definitely cybercafes popping up everywhere. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 towns, right? And so that's all great as far as we're concerned, right? Because the adopters of those live relatively closer to market towns. They can reach them pretty easily. And so, but at the same time, there's still going to be heterogeneity. There's going to be people who are farther away, who don't have the internet access, who don't have the fancy phones. And so we think of these cyber cafes as eventually being potential hosts of voice services, right? They could host voice content that could extend their reach, their outreach, cater to a larger segment of the population. So again, I think these two approaches are complementary. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
What are the costs? What are the most expensive costs versus the cost per call? I'm just trying to figure out what is
the fixed costs are pretty manageable. We have an office, we've got some computers. With enough scale, those will go away to be very small, right? So the fixed costs are really manageable. It's the recurring airtime costs that's really the killer here, right? And so if you really want to subsidize access, even India has the cheapest airtime rates in the world, less than 1 or 2 cents a minute, right? Even with those costs, that could create a barrier, particularly the kind of this, if you were charged a cent per minute, or let's make it in your terms, 25 cents a minute for accessing the internet, would that change your browsing behavior? I think so, right? And so that's what we're seeing here, right? Is that cost really restricts what you're able to do. The other costs, the hosting costs, the telecoms are a pain to deal with. We handle that problem for our partners. We were able to drive those costs down over time with kind of economies of scale, hosting more and more services off one computer. But the recurring airtime costs are not under our control. We're working on some other stuff in that area, but that's pretty far off. We're working on kind of building really cheap base stations, but that's a whole different project with other collaborators and stuff. But that's a big problem. Yeah, any other questions? Cool. So I'll go on to I'll talk about one more project, and then we can leave it open. So this looks basically at social media, and how do we make social media more accessible to communities that we're talking about. The next project is going to talk about mapping. How do we make mapping, collecting geospatial information, more relevant in some of the same ways? So here's a map that my student took a picture of from Ethiopia. And so this was some early research we were doing into understanding agricultural planning in the country. And so my student went to visit an area where there was a new irrigation scheme was being planned. And so she first met with the planners and the people at the ministry, and they had a common complaint that we have no idea about what the local community is doing in an area, what they're farming, how they divide up their land, what land is being used for what. And so she looked at their map, in their ArcGIS fancy system, and there was just no data about that area in the system, right? They just didn't have any information from the community's perspective. Then she went to actually visit some of the cooperatives, agricultural organizations working in the area. And of course, they had rich information about that area. It just wasn't digitized. It was in these paper maps that had really rich information about where water sources were, what land was being used for what, where communities lived, how they divided their land, et cetera, et cetera. So the question arose, if communities have all of this rich information, if they've done so much reasoning about their local spaces, how can that information be communicated and used in participatory planning processes, right? And so that's the starting point for this project. This project is called Local Ground, map locally, visualize globally. And the idea here, so the idea here is how can we get this data in a form that's useful and actionable. So here we found that this problem is not only a problem in Ethiopia, it's also a problem in Richmond, California, which is literally 5 miles from my campus and like 2 miles from my house, right? So in Richmond, California, this is a public housing project there, and the local city was planning to redevelop a public park there. And again, they had no information about how that park was being used, how the youth saw that park. If you go to Yelp or if you go to Google Maps for some areas in Richmond or West Oakland, you think Yelp has everything. Yelp has nothing for these communities. There's just literally no information. It's an information wasteland from a geospatial perspective, right? And so how can we have these places have a representation online? How can we create channels for this kind of information to be collected? And so we worked on this project with the Nystrom Village Housing Authority and the City of Richmond. And we were working with a local community organization called the UC Berkeley Center for Cities and Schools, which has a program called Y-Plan, which engages youth in planning and deliberation and civic engagement. And so we were working in Kennedy High School with an 11th grade social studies class to help them participate in the mapping activity and the planning activity for that park. And so here the idea is, how can we get these youth, their perspectives, how can we communicate that to the planners, and how can we have their voice represented in the planning process? So again, we found a way to extend the reach of mapping to communities that were having difficulty accessing it otherwise, right? And so what we did was we created this system that allows you to map and contribute information using simple paper maps, right? And so you would go onto a website, go to an area of interest, print out a map of the area, annotate it using colored markers, pencils, stamps, stickers. All of that would be scanned or photographed, uploaded to our website. From that website, you could add other media, news stories, pictures, audio recordings, et cetera, all of that would be then browsable using this map interface where you could visualize all of the students' annotations, pictures, uploaded audio recordings. And so we use this system. So the idea here is, we tried to use Google Maps in the classroom, but there are a number of problems with this, right? So if you're using Google Maps, it took a long while for everyone just to get familiar with the interface, to learn how to make a point. The teacher had to get very much involved. Just created lots of barriers for effective adoption of that technology and for contribution of people's knowledge. Also, it's very difficult to use Google Maps when you're out in Richmond in the park, right? You're going to carry an iPhone or iPad and you're going to do this mapping. Well, this park is right across from a methadone clinic. It's got regular gun violence there. Probably not the place you want to be carrying around iPhones and iPads to do mapping, especially if you're a 10th grade kid. That's not what you want to be involved with. So here, you can extend all of those features just using simple paper maps. And it reduces the cost, reducing the requirements within the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. So how did we use this? So we had youth in Richmond, 11th graders, go out and map the park, take pictures of the area, describe what the current scenario was, how the park was being used. And so we got a lot of really interesting information from this, information that arguably would have been very difficult to collect using any structured process, right? And so here we have a description of the location of the Nystrom Village Community Center. And in parentheses, it says, not very welcoming, right? Another guy said, Nystrom Village Community Center, looks like a crack house, right? And so, again, this is out-of-band information that we might have never expected to collect otherwise, right? Basketball field, it's a robbery-type area, but in parentheses, low. So I guess the robbery risk is low, but it's present, right? So lots of information like this. One other thing we saw is that as soon as we got the maps back, a lot of the maps had cupcakes all over them, small drawings of cupcakes, right? And so we look at the map, and we've got cupcakes all over the place, and we're like, what are these cupcakes about, right? And so we had no idea. And so in the next meeting where we have the students actually working on a computer and reviewing the data that they entered, we were like, what are these cupcakes about? They're like, oh, cupcake is local slang for making out. And so all the cupcakes were places where kids went and made out in the park, right? Important for planners to know, I suppose. And so lots of out-of-band information that would have been very difficult to collect through a structured form or any kind of structured data collection exercise. So how do we recognize and represent these richness? Well, our answer is through drawings. The They also did an exercise mapping street lights that were out. This information was automatically aggregated, communicated to the authorities. So this was important not only to understand what the present situation of that park was, how it was being used, communicate that to the planners, but also for the students to be able to vision what a new Nystrom community would look like, what kinds of facilities it would have, right? And so again, using very low-tech methods. Right to the point, right? You know, so they could vision what a future Nystrom could look like, and also communicate that to the planners, right? And so we gave, again, very low-tech tools, clay, cardboard, construction paper, in a very participatory way, including the whole class, allowed them to investigate what the future would look like, and to georeference that future, right? To georeference it, to give it a place in space, right? So that it could be compared to what the plans were, right? So that you can look really closely at what the students had in mind, a basketball field at that location. And you could also have a real clear picture of what they currently saw there, which was a methadone clinic right across the street, right? And so all of these layers of information, students' perceptions, their visions, their dreams, their ideas, the planners' plans, current demographics, all of these could be represented in the same plane, in the same space, right? Now, that might seem really trivial to us, right? But it's hard to explain how important it is to take your voice, your representation, your ideas, your vision, your future, and to give it the same importance as the one that the fancy guys in suits have made up using their fancy software tools, right? So how can we represent both of these visions? How can we give them both the same importance? And our answer, clearly, is to implement it in software, right? So that you have no way of getting away from the community's perspective. It's there as a layer that you can see, just like you can see the data that you collected from the census last year, right? It's just as important as that. So you can see, this was part of a process where the youth were invited to communicate and present their ideas at a city hall meeting that was discussing the future of this park, and they used Local Ground, our tools, to basically communicate and explain their ideas.
A busy street. So if you had like a snack bar in the community, it would prevent people from walking across the street where it's unsafe.
Clearly having a hard time getting his head around it, But still, the efforts have to be made. And so, what's going on here? So again, this has been tested in now Richmond, Oakland. We also did a pilot experiment in Detroit. We're currently developing this software so that it can be used by anyone across the country off the internet. And so by January, we hope to release this both as an online hosted tool and also as an open source project. So we're very excited about this. So what did we learn from this? So first of all, when you kept things in paper, when you made it about stickers and colors and crayons and writing and drawing and less about clicking and digging through, it just became a lot more fun. It wasn't about figuring out the complexity of this phone or this interface or this GIS tool or this GPS device. You get caught up in all of that, batteries and charging and what the right interface is, and is it going to download the data into your system, right? Didn't need to worry about all of that. It stayed in a plane where everyone could participate and it remained fun, right? It didn't create any barriers for either the teacher to participate or for any students to participate. And all of this could have been done with limited training, limited supervision, obtaining all of this other information, et cetera. I think I've said most of the other stuff here. So a lot of research here. I'll just go through this quickly. There's a lot of computer vision questions about how to process this data effectively, how to deal with the different kinds of symbols. We want to think about new applications for this kind of technology and participatory planning more broadly, budgeting, resource allocation, advocacy, entrepreneurship, to create better tools for browsing and visualizing this data. Obviously, to saw from some of the interfaces, it's really hard to make sense of all that information sometimes. And so can we make tools that may allow you to effectively aggregate, effectively synthesize, again, in a participatory way, some of the information that's being presented. And the final thing which we're really excited about is that can we use tools like this, tools like Awazday also, to collect data that's relevant to local communities. And that locally relevant data, can we use that to build more data literacy, statistical literacy amongst communities? What does it mean to aggregate? What does it mean to look at something longitudinally? What does it mean to compare? Right? So can we build some of those skills into communities, into youth at an early age? So that's this project. I'll take any questions about local ground before I close. Yeah.
With the first technology that you were showing us, an individual farmer's, I have a question. If I ask this question, someone will answer it and that'll benefit me. For this second project, what is the incentivization system for like the first thing, if I draw a picture and submit it to this thing, I might be able to influence policy or it might just sort of end up here.
Isn't that the million-dollar question, though? I don't know. That's a great question. I don't have a simple answer to that. And I'll tell my non-answer through an anecdote, right? So students did all this work, and the one thing, out of all the things they did, is that what they really wanted was a graffiti wall through the park, right? They had, a three-dimensional mock-up of the graffiti wall. They had put it on the map. It was there, highlighted, central to everything, right? Showed it to the suit guy. You saw that, right? And so they were super excited about it. Is there a graffiti wall? No. There's no graffiti wall, right? Because the city manager thinks it's too expensive, thinks it could lead to negative elements in the park, lots of things, right? And so I think the incentive is just like any incentive in democracy. You hope it'll work out, but many times it doesn't, right? so there's some larger problems here. I think this is part of the answer, but clearly not the whole answer, right? How to include this kind of process, this kind of tool within our democratic process, within our representative process is a really open, hard, interesting question, which I'm interested in, but not even close to solving. So, yeah.
Students, or has it, have you worked with adults? Because I mean, with the whole markers play thing, it's very student-oriented, so.
It might be, right? So I think, that we haven't tested anywhere else yet. I think another application that might be really useful, might be really applicable, local ground might be applicable for, is doing the same thing with, again, communities like the communities in India who are very remote, don't have computing resources, right? So if you want to have them document land use, water availability, et cetera, I think this tool becomes useful for another set of reasons that are less about fun and more about access, right? And so I think there are other situations where this kind of tool would be applicable, but maybe for different reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, just building off that last point, it seemed like the inspiration for this, or at least the chronology of the presentation, was looking at that map in Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. I was wondering what you would see as like the main differences and that, or like the additional challenges in trying to adapt something like this to that situation, and comparing, really harnessing the wealth of knowledge in that context as compared to the California setting.
Right. So I think the technology challenges are pretty similar, in that you have limited opportunities. And one of the main challenges both of the projects address is the difficulty of doing training and support in these contexts, right? And so this addresses that same challenge by using paper and simple digital scanning, right? So I think the differences are really institutional rather than technological, right? And so here in the school, we benefited a lot from there being an institution that was already vested with the students and engaged with them in this planning exercise, who could facilitate all of the activities. And the technology itself required that kind of tight feedback loop. For example, we never would have understood what the cupcakes meant unless we were able to show the maps back to the students, have them deliberate over them. They could have never made the final presentations unless they all worked together. All of that clay and stuff would not have been possible remotely, right? And so that kind of tight feedback loop that was facilitated by having a tight institutional linkage might be more difficult in situations where that institutional framework didn't exist, of being able to engage with a large number of farmers, have them come repeatedly to participate in these kinds of activities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are all challenges that we would face. Any other questions? Yeah.
To comment
There is another arena where very similar processes, but I haven't seen the underlying software support, and that's on a smaller scale involving particularly teens in designing remodeling spaces within a building, within a facility.
Right.
And actually, there's students out in California that are studying sort of how students are learning and developing learning environments for them. So I think that's, I actually am very interested because we're doing some work with that. It'd be interesting to see your software to try it on a smaller scale.
Yeah, they call it, Google is building some indoor mapping tools now, so that helps us too. Yeah, yeah, it'd be interesting to see like a SketchUp 3D modeling tool, how it would work. Yeah, Dan.
I was thinking about what was the similarity between the two projects you mentioned.
I'm going to get to that, but
You're going that now? Okay, I can hold.
No, you can give it a shot.
Well,
I'll speak from a technology perspective, but maybe.
well, I was just wondering whether I should say or I should let you take a first shot at it.
Either way is fine.
Go ahead.
You sure?
Yeah, please.
I don't know. I want to hear. I'd rather hear.
Well, I think this would be an interesting quiz.
Yeah.
For all of us, because they seem quite different on the surface. But I think to me, the thread goes back to a little conversation we were having before, which is about how do you get potentially needed information to people that doesn't use the kind of model that, in a way, one way, it's almost a philosophical piece of this is that we all seem to be driven by the technologies that we know how to use, whether they're iPhones or mobile phones or whatever. But it seems to me what is common between the two of these projects is an effort, maybe by chance, maybe by explicit design, I don't know, you're about ready to say, that tries to fulfill a need of the customer, of the client, for information that is not easily provided by the common ways that technology are provided. So you've found a way to find the interstices between the human potential user and models that favor information that can be locally used.
That's right.
Is that an interpretation?
Yeah, I think that's very close. And so, yeah, to just go a little bit further, I think it's to be able for communities to provide that information using a representation and medium that's as comfortable and as familiar to them as possible, right? So that all of the activity, I feel like a lot of our times, our engagement with technology becomes about the technology than about what we're using the technology to do, right? And so by taking that technology that one step further so that people can use as close to a familiar or as natural of a representation as possible, your spoken voice and drawings on paper, right? And then having computers do the hard work of interpreting that, computers and people, right? So that's exactly what I'm going to talk about, right? So drawings and voices, right? Computer scientists don't deal in drawings and voices. You know, we're not interested in those. We're interested in bits, ones and zeros, right? So this is something that's very heretical for a computer scientist to be working with drawings and voices. It's almost like that's not data. That's a mess. That's not data. You know, drawings and voices aren't data. You know, they're what people who don't know how to deal with data do, right? And so, how can we make these representations that are very natural and familiar to them interpretable and actionable to people who live with a different worldview? And that's what this work is really about, is that you take Pigpen, you image it or you capture it using whatever available technology you have, in this case cell phones or digital cameras. You add some computational power, you add some people power, you do it in the internet so that all of these powers have ability to access the same substrate, and that leads to beautiful music, right? And so this is the idea, combination of computers and humans to achieve joint ends. So that's the story. You know, we'll see where it goes next. Thanks. A lot of this work was done with graduate students. Neil Patel is the lead student. He just graduated with his Ph.D. on the Avaz Day work. Sarah Van Wart is leading the efforts on local ground. Lots of great partners and lots of great users. And thanks very much. I'll take any questions that you have. Yeah.
About drawings and voices.
How
did you analyze the drawings?
That's a great question, too. So that's an active area of inquiry. I don't think we have a final solution there. But we basically have essentially data curation and visualization tools that students use to basically summarize. So basically what they do is they are able to visualize all of the maps on top of one another and essentially do value addition, like doing vector diagrams over that, and they can say, hey, this location has a lot of people putting in cupcakes or commenting about cleanliness, right? And so all of that synthesis is done with people using these interactive tools. And there's like a tension here. I could go on and say how we'll do some of these things automatically, like, hey, we can do OCR, recognize the characters, and we'll do some automated aggregation and tag clouds and blah, 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 blah. And we're going to do some of that, but at the same time, not forgetting that it's not the outcome that's important, but it's the process that leads to the outcome, right? And so we want to be able to do all of those things while retaining people in that process as part of that process, because as we all know, the synthesis has a lot of agency to it too. How you choose to summarize, how you choose to represent. And so we want to make sure students stay involved in those activities as well. And so how to do that is still an open question. We're still working on it. Right now, I think we're not particularly far along beyond letting people visualize the maps and add more stuff. But we're adding support for structured data. So you can now, in the latest version of the system, you can number points and put stickers there. You can say this is point 1, this is point 2, point 3. And on the back, there's basically a spreadsheet. So you can say for location 1, field 1 is this, field 2 is this, field 3 is this. This has both the benefits of structured data collection, plus they can write whatever they want still in the margins and stuff, right? And so you retain the provenance of the data. So we're working on it. But it's this fine balance between structure and making decisions on people's behalf, Great, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. So, and all of our stuff's open source, so if you ever want to use it, feel free to download it and do what you like.